Gina was my teammate. She never let me fall. I never let her fall. She nursed me back to health when I was dying from his abuse. My friendship with her is the only thing that was good out of this situation. We said we will someday make it out alive, and we did.
May 6, 2013 began as an ordinary Monday in Cleveland, Ohio. The spring air carried the kind of warmth that makes people open their windows, that makes children play outside longer, that makes neighbors step onto their porches just to feel the breeze. On Seymour Avenue, a working-class street on Cleveland's west side, the afternoon sun filtered through mature trees lining both sides of the road. Houses stood close together, mostly two-story structures with small front yards, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knows everyone, where people watch out for each other's children, where borrowed lawn mowers and shared meals define community. Charles Ramsey arrived home from work that afternoon carrying his McDonald's bag, looking forward to a quiet evening. He had lived on Seymour Avenue long enough to know the rhythm of the street, the sounds that belonged and those that did not. As he climbed his porch steps, something pulled his attention away from his dinner. Screaming. Not the playful shrieks of children or the raised voices of an argument, but something desperate, something that made his heart rate quicken before his mind fully processed what he was hearing. The screams came from the house next door, from behind the white storm door of 2207 Seymour Avenue. Ramsey recognized the property immediately. It belonged to Ariel Castro, a guy he had shared beers with, someone who seemed completely normal, someone who played bass in a local band and barbecued ribs in his backyard. Ramsey approached the door and saw a young woman's face pressed against the glass, her hands pounding, her voice hoarse with desperation. The woman was screaming that she was trapped, that she needed help, that she had been inside for a long time. Ramsey did not hesitate. He suggested they kick out the bottom panel of the storm door. Together, Ramsey on the outside and the woman on the inside, they kicked until a hole opened large enough for her to crawl through. She emerged clutching a small child, a girl maybe 6 years old. Once free of the house, the woman's words came in a torrent that would change everything. "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry," she said, a statement so impossible that it should have been met with disbelief. Amanda Berry had been missing for nearly 10 years. Most people in Cleveland believed she was dead. Her mother had died 3 years earlier, convinced she would never see her daughter again. Yet here she stood on Seymour Avenue, alive, holding a child who had not existed when she disappeared. While Ramsey called 911 from his home, Berry used a neighbor's phone to make her own call. Her voice on that recording would become one of the most haunting and hopeful pieces of audio in modern crime history. "I've been kidnapped and been missing for 10 years, Berry told the dispatcher. "I'm here, I'm free now." Cleveland police officers Michael Tracy, Barbara Johnson, and Anthony Espada arrived within minutes. They entered Castro's house with weapons drawn, announcing themselves as they moved through the hallway. What they found inside would reveal a horror that had existed just feet away from neighbors who had no idea, on a street where children played, where people walked their dogs, where life continued normally for a decade while 3 women lived in chains. A bedroom door opened slightly and a thin figure emerged. Michelle Knight entered the hallway and leaped into an officer's arms, repeating the words, "You saved me," over and over. Then Gina DeJesus appeared from another room. Both women walked out of the house for the first time in nearly 10 years. They walked out into sunlight, into fresh air, into a world that had continued without them. The 3 women, along with Berry's daughter, were immediately taken to Metro Health Medical Center. News of their rescue spread through Cleveland like electricity. Police cordoned off Seymour Avenue as investigators descended on the white clapboard house. Neighbors gathered in clusters, stunned and disbelieving. Parents who had trusted Castro to drive their children on school bus routes struggled to reconcile the friendly neighbor they knew with the monster who had imprisoned 3 young women. FBI Special Agent Steve Anthony, his voice thick with emotion, told reporters, "Finally, the nightmare is over. Yes, even law enforcement personnel do shed tears." The rescue set in motion an investigation that would uncover the full scope of Ariel Castro's crimes. Crimes that had begun more than a decade earlier, when he transformed his house into a prison, specifically designed to hold captives no one knew were there. 2207 Seymour Avenue stood in the middle of a tree-lined block in Cleveland's West Side neighborhood, a working-class area predominantly Hispanic, where families had lived for generations. The house itself was unremarkable, a two-story white clapboard structure with a small front yard, the kind of building that could be found on thousands of streets across American cities. Nothing about its exterior suggested the horror contained within its walls. Ariel Castro purchased the property in April 1992 for $12,000. By 2012, the county had assessed its value at $36,100, modest by any standard. The house faced potential repossession over unpaid taxes, with Castro owing approximately $2,501 for the period between 2010 and 2012. From the outside, it appeared to be just another house in need of maintenance, owned by someone struggling financially. The structure featured 2 stories with a basement, approximately 900 square feet per floor. The exterior paint had faded and peeled in places. Most significantly for Castro's purposes, the windows were covered or boarded up in ways that prevented anyone from seeing inside. Neighbors had noticed this, but attributed it to Castro's eccentricities or perhaps his desire for privacy. In a neighborhood where people often worked long hours and minded their own business, covered windows did not immediately signal danger. When Google's Street View camera rolled past Seymour Avenue documenting the world with its voracious digital eye, the house at 2207 was almost entirely hidden behind a large tree. Seen but unseen, noticed but unfathomed. The image captured the essential tragedy of the Cleveland kidnappings, how horror can exist in plain sight, how we can look directly at something without truly seeing it. The interior layout served Castro's dark purposes with chilling effectiveness. The basement initially functioned as the primary prison, with chains and locks installed to restrain his captives. Over time, Castro moved the women to rooms on the second floor, each space carefully secured. He installed multiple locks on bedroom doors, heavy enough to prevent escape attempts. The windows on the upper floor were not only covered, but reinforced, some boarded up from the inside in ways that made them impossible to open or break. According to court documents and FBI investigative materials, Castro modified the house specifically to imprison the women. He chained them by their ankles to walls or heavy furniture. He provided plastic toilets in their bedrooms that he emptied infrequently, creating degrading and unsanitary conditions. At one point, investigators believe he locked all 3 women in a vehicle in his garage for 3 days while he had a visitor, demonstrating the extreme measures he took to prevent discovery. The rooms where the women were held became psychological torture chambers as much as physical ones. They existed in darkness much of the time, with boarded windows preventing natural light. The isolation was near complete. They could hear the sounds of the outside world, children playing, neighbors talking, cars passing, life continuing just beyond walls they could not breach. The proximity to normalcy made the captivity even more psychologically devastating. Remarkably, police had been to the house at least twice during the decade the women were imprisoned there. In 2000, Castro called police to report a fight on the street outside his home. In 2004, officers investigated after Castro left a child unattended on his school bus. That investigation found no evidence of a crime requiring a home visit, and officers did not enter the house to look around. The women were there, chained and hidden, while police stood feet away. Neighbors passed the house daily. Children walked by it on their way to school. The mail carrier delivered letters. Life swirled around 2207 Seymour Avenue while inside, 3 women lived in conditions that would later be compared to prisoner-of-war camps. The house kept its secrets through a combination of Castro's careful planning, the women's fear-induced silence, and a community's inability to imagine such horror existing in their midst. When investigators finally processed the crime scene after the May 2013 rescue, they found extensive physical evidence of the imprisonment. Chains hung from walls. Locks secured every door. The modifications Castro had made to the structure told the story of premeditation and long-term planning. This was not a crime of impulse, but a carefully constructed system designed to hold human beings captive indefinitely. Ariel Castro was born on July 10, 1960. While most sources identify Puerto Rico as his birthplace, with some specifically citing the municipality of Yauco, his early childhood took place on the island territory before his family emigrated to Cleveland, Ohio, where members of his extended family had already established themselves. The Castro family settled into Cleveland's Hispanic community, part of a wave of Puerto Rican migration to industrial northern cities in the post-war decades. Castro's father, Nane Castro, ran a used car business in Cleveland. He established the family economically and became a recognizable figure in the community before his death in 2004. Castro's uncle, Julio Castro, who went by the nickname Ceci, became a pillar of Cleveland's Hispanic community. He ran the Carabay Grocery, a corner store that served as a gathering place and community hub. The Castro family name was associated with hard work and community involvement, which made Ariel Castro's later crimes even more shocking to those who knew the family. As a young man, Castro appeared to follow a conventional path. He worked steadily and eventually secured employment as a school bus driver, a position he would hold for 22 years. The job brought him into contact with hundreds of children and families over more than 2 decades. Parents trusted him with their children. The school district trusted him with responsibility. His employment record, however, showed multiple disciplinary infractions over the years, including leaving a child unattended on a bus in 2004, making illegal turns with students aboard in 2009, and using his school bus for personal shopping trips. The final incident that led to his firing in November 2012 occurred in September that year, when he left his bus unattended and unlocked 2 blocks from his home after his preschool route had been canceled. Castro also pursued music, playing bass guitar in several local bands. He performed with Grupo Canon, a popular Latino band in Cleveland, on and off for 15 years. Band members and fellow musicians knew him as reliable and talented. He participated in the city's vibrant Latino music scene, attending events and building a network of acquaintances who saw him as a regular guy pursuing his passion. His personality, as described by those who knew him casually, seemed unremarkable. Neighbor Charles Ramsey, who would later help Amanda Berry escape, said he had eaten meals and drunk beer with Castro. "He's somebody you look away because he's not doing nothing but the average stuff," Ramsey told a local television station. "There's nothing exciting about him." This ordinariness functioned as camouflage. Castro maintained his lawn, tinkered with his motorcycle, and grilled ribs on his barbecue. He was friendly enough to neighbors without being intrusive. He did not stand out. In a world where we expect monsters to look monstrous, Castro's ability to appear completely normal allowed him to hide in plain sight for over a decade. On his Facebook profile, Castro presented himself as a family man. He identified himself as the grandfather of 5 children and posted congratulatory messages to his daughter Arlene on the birth of her child in April 2013, just weeks before his arrest. The digital persona showed someone engaged with family life, someone ordinary enough to be invisible. Yet there were people who saw through the facade, primarily those who knew him intimately rather than casually. Darlene Dews Rise, a work colleague at the school district, told the BBC she did not like working with Castro. "I found him to be very mean and hateful with the children," she said. Her observation pointed to a darker undercurrent beneath the friendly neighbor persona, a capacity for cruelty that manifested when he held power over vulnerable individuals. Juan Perez, who grew up in the neighborhood, had initially thought Castro was a fun guy and said parents on the street trusted him. This trust would later seem bitterly ironic given what Castro was doing inside his home. He weaponized the community's trust, using his position as a school bus driver and a neighbor to establish credibility that helped deflect suspicion. Castro's duality extended to participating in search efforts for his own victims. When Gina DeJesus disappeared, he attended vigils held by her family. He stood among the grieving, watched them weep, and offered sympathy, all while knowing exactly where Gina was. This behavior demonstrated a profound psychological detachment, an ability to separate his public persona from his private actions, a compartmentalization that enabled him to continue his crimes for years. The psychological profile that would emerge after his arrest described not mental illness, but a personality disorder characterized by profound lack of empathy. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Gregory Sothoff testified that Castro had no psychiatric illness whatsoever. Experts who analyzed his behavior and statements identified him as likely suffering from antisocial personality disorder with sexual sadism, someone who derived pleasure from inflicting suffering, someone who knew exactly what he was doing but refused to accept responsibility. Castro was born into a community, worked among people, played music for audiences, and existed in public spaces for decades. Yet he constructed an entirely separate existence within his house, a realm of total control where he acted out his darkest impulses. Understanding how someone could maintain this double life for so long remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the Cleveland kidnappings. Before Ariel Castro imprisoned 3 strangers, he terrorized the woman he lived with and their children. Grimalda Figueroa became involved with Castro in the early 1980s. According to court records and family accounts, they lived together in a common-law relationship rather than formal marriage and had at least 3 children together. Ariel, who went by Anthony, Angie, and Emily Castro. The family lived at 2207 Seymour Avenue, the same house Castro had purchased in April 1992, the same house that would later become a prison for his kidnapping victims. Figueroa's relatives would later describe their relationship as a nightmare of escalating violence and psychological control. The abuse began early and intensified over the years, establishing a pattern that would prefigure Castro's later crimes. He beat Figueroa repeatedly and severely, causing injuries that required medical attention and left permanent damage. Court documents obtained by CBS News detailed the horrific catalog of abuse Figueroa endured. According to a domestic violence protection order she filed on August 29, 2005, Castro had broken her nose twice, broken her ribs, caused lacerations, knocked out a tooth, and caused a blood clot on her brain that resulted in an inoperable tumor. He had dislocated both of her shoulders at different times. These were not isolated incidents, but a sustained campaign of violence over years. The petition also documented Castro's threats. He had threatened to kill Figueroa and their daughters 3 to 4 times in 2005 alone. The violence existed alongside psychological terror, creating an environment where Figueroa and her children lived in constant fear. The threats were specific and credible enough that Figueroa sought legal protection, though she would ultimately not follow through with the hearing. Figueroa's sister, Elida Caraballo, provided gut-wrenching details to the Associated Press about the abuse she witnessed. Castro had pushed Figueroa down a flight of stairs. He had broken her nose and dislocated her shoulder repeatedly. In one particularly disturbing incident, Caraballo described how Castro shoved Figueroa into a cardboard box and closed the flaps over her head, telling her, "You stay there until I tell you to get out." Caraballo, who cried while recounting her sister's torment, had been so frightened by this incident that she ran downstairs to get her parents. The domestic violence protection order filed in 2005 revealed another dimension of Castro's controlling behavior. Despite Figueroa having full custody of their children, Castro frequently abducts daughters and keeps them from mother/petitioner/legal custodian. This pattern of separating children from their mother and holding them against her wishes foreshadowed his later kidnapping crimes. Castro also locked Figueroa and their children inside the house, preventing them from leaving even for legitimate reasons. Relatives described him playing twisted psychological games, using isolation and control to maintain power over his family. The same house that would later imprison Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight had already functioned as a prison for Figueroa and her children. Figueroa eventually left Castro in 1996, taking custody of their children with her. The separation required immense courage given the severity of Castro's violence and his explicit threats to kill her. Yet even after the separation, Castro's violence followed her. The 2005 protection order came nearly a decade after she had left, indicating that he continued to pose a threat. Tragically, the protection order Figueroa filed was never enforced. She did not appear for the scheduled hearing, and the petition was dismissed. The reasons for her non-appearance remain unclear, but domestic violence experts note that victims often face enormous barriers to following through with legal proceedings, including fear of retaliation, economic pressure, and psychological trauma. In another incident that demonstrated Castro's propensity for violence against women, court records show that in 1993, a grand jury considered sexual assault charges against Castro related to an accusation made by the husband of Figueroa's friend, though the details and outcome of these proceedings remain unclear in public records. Figueroa lived with the consequences of Castro's violence for the rest of her life. The inoperable tumor on her brain, caused by abuse, contributed to her declining health. She suffered from the accumulated physical damage of years of beatings. In 2012, after a long illness, Grimelda Figueroa died. She was 52 years old. Her death came just 1 year before her former partner's arrest would shock the world. The domestic violence Castro inflicted on Figueroa established crucial patterns that characterized his later crimes. The need for absolute control, the use of physical violence to maintain that control, the enjoyment of psychological torture, and the ability to compartmentalize his abusive behavior from his public persona. Those who studied Castro's case noted that domestic violence often escalates, and that abusers who are not held accountable frequently continue or intensify their violent behavior. Figueroa's children grew up witnessing their father's violence against their mother. The trauma rippled through generations, affecting not just Figueroa but everyone in her family. When Castro's kidnapping crimes were revealed, Figueroa's relatives felt vindicated in their long-held belief that he was dangerous. But that vindication came too late to save 3 other women from suffering similar or worse abuse. Michelle Knight was 21 years old when she vanished on August 23, 2002. Unlike the cases that would follow hers, Michelle's disappearance received relatively little public attention at the time. Several factors contributed to this disparity in media coverage and investigative resources, factors that reflect troubling patterns in how society responds to missing persons based on age, circumstances, and family situation. Michelle had experienced a difficult life before her abduction. She was a young adult navigating complex family situations and personal challenges. She had a young son whom she was fighting to maintain custody of through the family court system. On the day she disappeared, Michelle had a court hearing related to custody of her child. She never appeared at that hearing. The circumstances of her abduction followed a pattern Castro would repeat. He offered Michelle a ride. Michelle knew one of Castro's daughters, which provided the basis for trust. Castro presented himself as someone safe, someone connected to people she knew, someone offering help rather than harm. Michelle accepted the ride. Once Michelle was inside his vehicle, Castro took her to his house on Seymour Avenue. He convinced her to come inside under some pretense. Once Michelle crossed the threshold, her decade of captivity began. Castro immediately raped her. He chained her in the basement. The life she had known ended in an afternoon. Michelle's family reported her missing, but the initial investigation faced challenges. Because Michelle was an adult and had been dealing with difficult personal circumstances, some investigators theorized she might have left voluntarily. This assumption, common in cases involving adults with complex lives, meant Michelle's case did not receive the same level of urgency as cases involving younger teenagers who disappeared under clearly suspicious circumstances. The media coverage of Michelle's disappearance remained minimal. Her face did not appear on constant news broadcasts. There were no large-scale community searches. The vigils and sustained public attention that would characterize the searches for Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus never materialized for Michelle. She became one of thousands of missing adults whose cases fade from public consciousness, whose families search alone, who are presumed to have chosen their absence. Inside Castro's house, Michelle endured conditions of unimaginable cruelty. As Castro's first captive, She faced his violence without the buffer of other prisoners who might draw his attention. She was alone in her suffering for the first year of her captivity, until Amanda Berry joined her in April 2003. Castro singled Michelle out for particularly severe abuse. Michelle became pregnant multiple times during her captivity. Each time, Castro terminated the pregnancies through violence. He starved her. He beat her stomach and torso until she miscarried. The physical pain of these forced miscarriages was compounded by the psychological trauma of repeated violations of her bodily autonomy. Prosecutors would later charge Castro with aggravated murder for his role in these pregnancy terminations, charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty. The abuse Michelle endured was not only physical but psychological. Castro used isolation, threats, and mind games to break her spirit. He told her she was worthless, that no one was looking for her, that she deserved what was happening to her. This psychological warfare aimed to destroy her sense of self and hope for rescue. Michelle spent 11 years in captivity, longer than the other two women. Every day she survived was an act of resistance against Castro's attempts to destroy her. She developed strategies to endure, to maintain some core sense of self despite the efforts to erase her identity. She would later describe these years as 11 years of hell, but also demonstrate that Castro had failed to completely break her. Outside Castro's house, life continued. Michelle's son grew up without his mother. The family court resolved custody questions in her absence. Friends and family members wondered what had happened to her, whether she was alive, whether she would ever return. Some held on to hope, while others reluctantly accepted that Michelle was likely dead. The relative lack of public attention to Michelle's case reflected systemic inequities in how law enforcement and media respond to missing persons. Studies have documented that cases involving young white girls and women receive disproportionate attention compared to cases involving adults, minorities, or individuals with complex backgrounds. Michelle's case fell into the category of missing persons who, fairly or not, were presumed to have agency in their disappearance. This presumption was entirely wrong. Michelle had no agency, no choice, no ability to return. She was a prisoner enduring torture while the world outside moved on without her. The discrepancy between the attention her case received and the horror she was experiencing represented a kind of secondary victimization, an abandonment by systems designed to protect citizens. When Michelle was finally rescued on May 6, 2013, she had spent more than a decade as Castro's prisoner. She was 32 years old, having lost her entire 20s to captivity. The young woman who had been trying to be a mother to her son had been forcibly prevented from mothering anyone, even herself. Yet she had survived, and her survival became a testament to human resilience in the face of inhuman cruelty. Amanda Berry was 16 years old when she disappeared on April 21, 2003, the day before her 17th birthday. Unlike Michelle Knight's disappearance, Amanda's case immediately captured public attention and sparked widespread community mobilization. She was a teenager, a daughter with a close family, a young woman with a clear future ahead of her. Her vanishing was unambiguously suspicious from the beginning. Amanda had been working at a Burger King, taking on responsibility and earning money as many teenagers do. On that April evening, she finished her shift and prepared to go home. The circumstances of her disappearance were unclear at first, adding to the mystery and fear. Amanda was last seen leaving her workplace. Then she was gone. Ariel Castro offered Amanda a ride home. She knew his daughter, which created a connection that made the offer seem safe rather than dangerous. Castro was a parent, a school bus driver, someone familiar from the community. Amanda had no reason to suspect that accepting this ride would result in her losing the next decade of her life. Like Michelle before her, Amanda was taken to Castro's house on Seymour Avenue. Once inside, she was assaulted and imprisoned. Castro chained her in the basement alongside Michelle Knight, though he kept the women separated enough that they could not easily communicate. Amanda's 17th birthday, which should have been a celebration, instead marked her first full day of captivity. Amanda's family launched an immediate and massive search. Her mother, Lawana Miller, became a tireless advocate, appearing on news programs, organizing community searches, and refusing to give up hope that her daughter would be found alive. The Cleveland media covered the case extensively. Amanda's face appeared on missing persons posters throughout the city. The FBI joined the investigation. Volunteers combed neighborhoods looking for any trace of the missing teenager. The community response to Amanda's disappearance demonstrated both the best and worst of public mobilization. People genuinely wanted to help, but false leads and dead ends frustrated efforts. Reported sightings of Amanda came from various locations, none of which led to her recovery. Each false hope raised and then dashed took a psychological toll on her family. In 2004, someone called Amanda's mother claiming to be Amanda, saying she was fine and wanted to be left alone. The call was later revealed to be a cruel hoax, but it caused immeasurable pain to a mother desperately seeking any information about her daughter. The FBI analyzed the call and determined it was not Amanda's voice, but the damage was done. Lawana Miller never stopped believing her daughter was alive, never stopped searching, never accepted the growing consensus that Amanda must be dead. In 2006, 3 years after Amanda's disappearance, Lawana's health began declining. The stress and heartbreak of losing her daughter took a physical toll. In March 2006, Lawana Miller died of heart failure. She was 43 years old. Amanda would learn of her mother's death while in captivity, adding profound grief to her already unbearable suffering. Castro allowed her to know that her mother had died believing she would never see Amanda again, died without closure, died heartbroken. This psychological cruelty was characteristic of Castro's treatment of his prisoners. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Amanda endured nearly daily sexual assaults. Castro's abuse was methodical and sustained. He maintained control through violence, threats, and manipulation. Amanda was chained, starved, and tortured. Yet she found ways to survive, to maintain hope, to believe that somehow she would eventually escape. In 2005, Amanda became pregnant. Unlike Michelle Knight, whose pregnancies Castro violently terminated, Amanda's pregnancy was allowed to continue. The reasons for this differential treatment remain unclear, though some investigators have speculated Castro wanted a child he could control from birth. According to court testimony and the women's own accounts, Amanda gave birth to a daughter on Christmas Day 2006. The birth took place under conditions that will be detailed later, but it resulted in Amanda's daughter Jocelyn, who would become the 4th person imprisoned in Castro's house. Amanda's love for her daughter became her primary motivation for survival. She could not give up hope of escape because she needed to give Jocelyn a life beyond the walls of that house. This maternal determination sustained Amanda through years of continued abuse. Meanwhile, outside the house, Amanda's case gradually moved from active investigation to cold case status. Years passed without significant leads. The massive searches gave way to annual remembrance vigils. Most investigators, though they continued working the case, privately believed Amanda was dead. Only her family refused to accept this conclusion. On Seymour Avenue, neighbors remained unaware that the missing teenager whose face had been on the news for years was imprisoned just feet away. Castro continued playing bass in local bands, driving his school bus until his termination in November 2012, and maintaining his yard. The disconnect between the public search for Amanda and her actual proximity to the community searching for her remains, one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Gina DeJesus was 14 years old when she disappeared on April 2, 2004. Her vanishing followed a similar pattern to Amanda Berry's abduction the previous year, but with an even closer connection to Ariel Castro's family. Gina was the best friend of Castro's daughter, Arlene. She was a frequent visitor to the Castro home, knew the family well, and had no reason to fear Castro. On that April afternoon, Gina was walking home from her middle school. The route was familiar, one she had traveled countless times. She was with Arlene Castro for part of the walk, but they parted ways before Gina reached her home. Somewhere during that short distance, Ariel Castro intercepted his daughter's best friend. Castro convinced Gina to get into his vehicle, likely offering her a ride home. Given their family connection, Gina would have seen no threat in this offer. She knew Castro as her friend's father, as someone safe. Instead, he drove her to Seymour Avenue, took her inside his house, and added her to the collection of prisoners he was accumulating in his home. Gina's disappearance immediately triggered massive community mobilization. The Cleveland Hispanic community, to which both the DeJesus and Castro families belonged, organized vigils and search parties. The FBI intensified its investigation, looking for connections between Gina's disappearance and Amanda Berry's unsolved case from the previous year. The fact that two teenage girls had vanished from the same general area within a year suggested a possible serial abductor, though investigators had no concrete evidence linking the cases. Felix DeJesus and Nancy Ruiz, Gina's parents, became vocal advocates for their daughter. They refused to accept that Gina might be dead. They organized annual vigils on the anniversary of her disappearance. The family's grief was public and profound, and the community rallied around them with remarkable solidarity. In one of the case's most disturbing details, Ariel Castro attended these vigils. He stood alongside the DeJesus family, watching them weep for a daughter who was chained in his basement. He offered sympathy and support. He participated in the community's collective grief while being solely responsible for causing it. This behavior demonstrated a level of psychological compartmentalization and sadism that experts later struggled to fully explain. Castro's daughter Arlene, Gina's best friend, also mourned publicly for years. She organized remembrances and kept Gina's memory alive among their friend group. Arlene had no knowledge that her father had kidnapped her best friend. When the truth emerged years later, the psychological trauma of this revelation was devastating for Arlene and Castro's other children. Inside the house on Seymour Avenue, Gina joined Michelle Knight and Amanda Berry in captivity. The three women were held in separate rooms much of the time, isolated from each other to prevent them from forming bonds that might facilitate escape attempts. Castro controlled all aspects of their lives: what they ate, when they ate, whether they had light or darkness, whether they were chained or relatively free to move within their locked rooms. Gina was the youngest of the three captives, just 14 when her imprisonment began. She would spend her teenage years, the time when most young people are experiencing first freedoms, first relationships, and forming their identities, locked in darkness. She missed her quinceañera, the coming-of-age celebration important in Latino culture. She missed high school entirely. She lost the years that should have been filled with possibility. The abuse Gina endured was similar to what Michelle and Amanda experienced: regular sexual assaults, physical violence, psychological torture, and enforced isolation. Castro treated his prisoners as objects to be used and controlled rather than as human beings with rights, feelings, or futures. The trauma accumulated day after day, year after year. Outside the house, the investigation into Gina's disappearance continued, but produced no breakthrough. Despite the close proximity of the DeJesus home to Castro's house, despite Castro's intimate connection to Gina through his daughter, despite his participation in searches and vigils, investigators never identified him as a suspect. He hid in plain sight, protected by the assumption that no one could be so brazenly cruel as to help search for a victim they themselves had abducted. The Cleveland community maintained attention on Gina's case longer than many missing persons cases sustained public interest. The annual vigils continued. The family's advocacy kept Gina's name in local news. Yet as years passed, hope dimmed. Most people privately believed that Gina, like Amanda Berry and the lesser-known Michelle Knight, had been murdered and her body hidden somewhere. The possibility that all three women were alive in a house on Seymour Avenue seemed too improbable to seriously consider. Gina's mother, Nancy Ruiz, later described the years of not knowing as a special kind of torture. The uncertainty prevented grief from ever reaching resolution. Every phone ring could be news about Gina. Every knock on the door might be police with information. The liminal space between hope and despair became a permanent state of being. By 2013, Gina had been Castro's prisoner for 9 years. She was 23 years old, but had been robbed of the experiences that mark the transition from childhood to adulthood. Her family continued holding vigils and praying for a miracle they had stopped believing was possible. And then, on May 6th, the miracle happened. The basement of 2207 Seymour Avenue became Michelle Knight's introduction to hell in August 2002. Castro immediately chained her in the dark, cold space beneath his house. The chains attached to walls or heavy objects, limiting her movement to a small radius. She could not stand fully upright in some areas due to low ceilings. She could not escape. She could not call for help without risking immediate violent retaliation. The physical conditions of captivity were deliberately degrading. Castro provided plastic toilets that he emptied infrequently, forcing the women to live with the smell and unsanitary conditions. He controlled all access to food and water, using starvation as a tool of control. Meals came irregularly, often only once per day, and in portions designed to keep the women weak and compliant. Castro maintained control through multiple overlapping methods. Physical chains prevented escape. Locks on doors created barriers even if chains were temporarily removed. Violence or the threat of violence punished any resistance. Psychological manipulation broke down the women's sense of self and hope. Castro told them repeatedly that no one was searching for them, that their families had given up, that they deserved their suffering. The sexual violence was systematic and frequent. Castro raped his prisoners regularly, treating their bodies as his property. The assaults were not crimes of passion or impulse, but rather methodical acts of domination. Castro approached the abuse as something he was entitled to, something the women owed him for keeping them alive. When Amanda Berry joined Michelle in the basement in April 2003, the dynamic shifted slightly. Michelle was no longer completely alone in her suffering, though Castro worked to prevent the women from forming bonds. He kept them in separate areas of the basement initially, separated by walls or barriers that prevented easy communication. He monitored interactions when the women were in proximity, punishing attempts to offer each other comfort or make plans. Castro tested his prisoners in psychologically cruel ways. He would sometimes leave doors partially unlocked or create situations that appeared to offer escape opportunities. If the women attempted to take advantage of these apparent vulnerabilities, he beat them severely. The tests conditioned the women to fear escape attempts, to doubt their own judgment about when opportunities were genuine. This psychological conditioning proved remarkably effective at maintaining control. Gina DeJesus arrived in April 2004, bringing the number of prisoners to 3. Castro had to manage the logistics of imprisoning 3 people in a house where he occasionally had visitors. He developed systems for hiding the women when necessary. He boarded up windows and reinforced doors to prevent the women from attracting attention. He ran television and radio at high volumes to mask sounds the women might make. After several years of basement imprisonment, Castro moved the women to rooms on the 2nd floor. These rooms were converted into cells with heavy locks and reinforced windows. The move brought the women above ground, but did not meaningfully improve their conditions. They remained isolated, chained, and subject to Castro's absolute control. Each room became a woman's entire world for days or weeks at a time. The women marked time without clocks or consistent access to daylight. They listened to sounds from outside: children playing, neighbors talking, cars passing. They were so close to normalcy, yet utterly cut off from it. This proximity to the world they had been stolen from made the psychological torture even more acute. Castro's pattern of abuse varied in intensity, but never truly ceased. Some days he would enter a room multiple times to assault a prisoner. Other days he might leave the women alone, though the isolation itself was a form of torture. The unpredictability prevented the women from establishing any sense of routine or safety. They lived in constant hypervigilance, never knowing what each day would bring. The women developed survival strategies despite the overwhelming circumstances. They found ways to communicate with each other when Castro was not monitoring them closely. They shared information and offered what small comfort they could. They maintained secret acts of resistance, ways of preserving their sense of self against Castro's attempts to erase their identities. These small acts of defiance were dangerous, but psychologically necessary. Physical health deteriorated in captivity. Inadequate nutrition, lack of sunlight, limited physical activity, and the physical trauma of regular sexual violence and beatings created cumulative damage. The women developed health problems that went untreated. Castro provided no medical care, no dental care, no vision care. Bodies that should have been young and healthy instead showed the effects of sustained deprivation. Psychological trauma accumulated alongside physical damage. Post-traumatic stress developed in response to ongoing trauma rather than past trauma, creating a continuous state of crisis. Depression, anxiety, and dissociation became survival mechanisms. The women's minds developed ways to compartmentalize experiences, to create psychological distance from events that were too overwhelming to fully process in the moment. Castro documented nothing, kept no diary of his crimes, left no explanation for why he chose this particular method of causing suffering. His motivations remained locked in his mind, revealed only through his actions. Experts who later studied the case identified classic patterns of sexual sadism, of someone who derived pleasure from complete control over others, from the suffering he inflicted. The years blurred together for the women. 2003 became 2004, became 2005. Michelle had been captive for 3 years, then 4, then 5. Amanda endured her first year, then her second. Gina marked time from 14 to 15 to 16. Outside, their families aged and grieved. Inside, the women survived each day with the knowledge that tomorrow would likely be no better. Michelle Knight became pregnant for the first time approximately a year into her captivity. For any woman, pregnancy represents a profound physical and emotional experience. For Michelle, imprisoned and being regularly raped by her captor, pregnancy meant facing Ariel Castro's decision about whether a child would be allowed to exist. Castro decided it would not. Castro's method of terminating Michelle's pregnancies was brutally simple: violence. He starved her, drastically reducing her caloric intake to levels that could not sustain a pregnancy. He punched her repeatedly in the stomach and torso. He threw her downstairs. He denied her food for extended periods, sometimes weeks at a time, deliberately creating conditions where a fetus could not survive. Michelle became pregnant at least 5 times during her captivity, according to police reports and court documents. Each time, Castro intentionally terminated the pregnancy through physical violence. The psychological impact of these forced miscarriages compounded the trauma of the sexual assaults that caused the pregnancies. Michelle was denied not only bodily autonomy, but also the possibility of becoming a mother, something she had desperately wanted before her abduction. The forced miscarriages would later become the basis for aggravated murder charges against Castro. Under Ohio law, the intentional termination of a pregnancy through violence could constitute aggravated murder, charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty. Cuyahoga County prosecutor Timothy McGinty made clear that Castro would face these charges for every pregnancy he had violently ended. Amanda Berry also became pregnant during her captivity. Unlike Michelle's pregnancies, Amanda's was allowed to continue, though the reasons for Castro's differential treatment remain unclear. Some investigators have theorized that Castro wanted a child he could control from birth, a victim who would never know freedom and therefore might never attempt escape. According to court testimony and the women's own accounts, Amanda went into labor on Christmas Day, 2006. There was no hospital, no medical professionals, no sterile environment, no pain medication. Most reports indicate that Castro set up a plastic inflatable swimming pool in the room where Amanda was held, the kind sold at discount stores for children to play in during summer. Amanda was forced to give birth in this pool, in conditions that put both her life and her baby's life at extreme risk. Castro forced Michelle Knight to assist with the delivery, a decision of staggering cruelty. Michelle, who had lost multiple pregnancies to Castro's violence, who had been denied the possibility of motherhood herself, had to help deliver Amanda's baby. The psychological torture embedded in this arrangement demonstrated Castro's capacity for sadistic manipulation. The birth was complicated and dangerous. The baby initially was not breathing. Michelle performed mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the infant, saving the child's life in those critical first moments. Against all odds, both Amanda and the baby survived. The child was a girl, later named Jocelyn. Jocelyn's birth added another dimension of horror to the captivity. She was born into imprisonment, knew no world beyond the walls of Castro's house for the first 6 years of her life. Amanda's maternal love for Jocelyn became her primary motivation for survival. She could no longer consider giving up or provoking Castro to kill her because Jocelyn needed her mother. The presence of a child changed the calculus of survival for all 3 women. Castro allowed Jocelyn certain freedoms the adult women were denied. She was not typically chained. She had access to more of the house. She received slightly better food. Yet she was still a prisoner, still isolated from the outside world, still growing up in profoundly abnormal and traumatic circumstances. Amanda attempted to create as normal an environment as possible for Jocelyn within the constraints of their captivity. She schooled her daughter, teaching her to read and write. She celebrated birthdays as best she could with no resources. She told Jocelyn stories and sang her songs. Amanda fought to preserve her daughter's childhood, even in circumstances designed to destroy childhood entirely. The other women, Michelle and Gina, formed bonds with Jocelyn as well. They became her aunts in captivity, offering what love and normalcy they could. The child became a focal point of care and affection in an environment otherwise defined by abuse and deprivation. Protecting Jocelyn's innocence, to whatever degree possible, gave the women purpose beyond mere survival. For the women who had been stolen as teenagers and young adults, watching Jocelyn grow up in captivity was painful. She represented both hope, a sign that life continued even in this hell, and heartbreak, another victim of Castro's crimes. The women worried about what psychological damage growing up in such conditions would inflict on Jocelyn. DNA testing would later confirm that Ariel Castro was Jocelyn's biological father, the child conceived through rape, born in captivity, and imprisoned from birth. The genetic connection between captor and captive child added another layer of tragedy to an already incomprehensible situation. The pregnancies and forced miscarriages revealed the full extent of Castro's depravity. He was not content merely to imprison and assault the women. He wanted complete control over their reproductive capacity, the power to decide whether life would be allowed to exist. The violence he inflicted on Michelle's pregnancies demonstrated his willingness to destroy life to maintain control. Prosecutors would emphasize these acts when building their case. The forced miscarriages elevated Castro's crimes from kidnapping and rape to potential capital murder charges. They demonstrated premeditation, ongoing criminal intent, and a pattern of behavior designed to inflict maximum suffering. The pregnancies documented the sustained nature of the sexual violence and provided physical evidence of crimes that otherwise left few tangible traces. For Michelle, the loss of these pregnancies represented a grief that would endure long after her rescue. She had wanted to be a mother. Castro had stolen that from her before her abduction by preventing her from maintaining custody of her son. Then he had stolen it again, repeatedly, by violently ending the pregnancies that resulted from his assaults. The compounding losses created layers of trauma that would require years of therapy to even begin processing. Jocelyn Castro grew up knowing only one home, the prison at 2207 Seymour Avenue. From her birth on Christmas Day 2006 until her rescue in May 2013, the house was her entire universe. She knew no playgrounds, no schools, no parks, no grocery stores, no birthday parties with friends, no experiences that define childhood for most children. The circumstances of Jocelyn's existence were profoundly abnormal, yet to her they constituted normal. Psychologists later explained that children adapt to the environment they are born into, creating a baseline understanding of the world from whatever conditions surround them. For Jocelyn, being inside the house with her mother, Michelle, and Gina was simply how life was. Amanda Berry faced an impossible task, raising a child in captivity while being held captive herself. She had no parenting books, no pediatrician visits, no support system beyond 2 other traumatized prisoners. She had to navigate her daughter's development while enduring ongoing sexual violence and living under the absolute control of a sadistic captor. Despite these overwhelming constraints, Amanda worked tirelessly to give Jocelyn as much normalcy as possible. She created educational activities, teaching Jocelyn her letters and numbers. She made up games and stories. She sang lullabies. She celebrated Jocelyn's birthdays with whatever small gestures Castro permitted, or she could create from nothing. Amanda fought to preserve her daughter's innocence and spark her curiosity about a world Jocelyn had never seen. Michelle Knight and Gina DeJesus became surrogate aunts to Jocelyn. They interacted with her when Castro allowed contact between the prisoners. They offered affection and created moments of joy in an environment designed to crush joy. For Michelle, who had lost her own son and endured forced miscarriages, caring for Jocelyn provided a way to express maternal feelings that Castro had tried to destroy. For Gina, who had been 14 when she was abducted, Jocelyn represented hope and the continuation of life even in darkness. Castro's treatment of Jocelyn differed from his treatment of the adult women in significant ways. He did not typically chain her. She had more freedom of movement within the house. She received better food. These relative privileges existed not out of paternal love, but as a function of control. Jocelyn did not need chains because she had no knowledge of an outside world to escape to. She was imprisoned by ignorance rather than physical restraints. Yet Jocelyn was still profoundly harmed by her circumstances. She lived in a house with boarded windows where natural light rarely entered. Her social interactions were limited to 4 people: her mother, Michelle, Gina, and her father captor. She heard screams and sounds of violence. She witnessed her mother's fear and sadness, even if she could not fully understand the causes. The developmental impacts of such extreme isolation and abnormality would require years of intervention to address. Amanda lived with constant fear for Jocelyn's safety. Castro held absolute power over both of them. Amanda knew that any resistance could result in violence not just against herself, but potentially against her daughter. This knowledge created an additional layer of psychological control. Castro did not need to explicitly threaten Jocelyn to keep Amanda compliant. The implicit threat was always present. As Jocelyn grew from infant to toddler to young child, she developed language and curiosity. She asked questions about the world beyond the house, questions Amanda struggled to answer honestly without exposing her daughter to the full horror of their situation. Amanda had to balance being truthful enough to prepare Jocelyn for a potential future outside the house, while protecting her from knowledge that might be psychologically devastating. When police rescued the women on May 6, 2013, Jocelyn was 6 years old. She emerged from the house clutching her mother's hand, entering a world she had never experienced. Everything was new: natural sunlight, fresh air, cars, crowds of people, buildings other than the one house she had known. The sensory overload was overwhelming. At the hospital, medical staff tried to make Jocelyn comfortable. They gave her popsicles. They smiled at her. They marveled that she appeared physically healthy despite the circumstances of her birth and early childhood. Cleveland Police Deputy Chief Ed Tomba told reporters, "She looks great, happy, healthy, and ate a popsicle last night. Seeing her mother smile made her smile." Yet behind the resilient exterior, Jocelyn faced enormous psychological challenges. She had to learn to navigate a world vastly different from the only one she had known. She had to adjust to crowds, noise, new people, new places, new rules. She had to process the truth that her previous life had been profoundly abnormal. She had to understand, in age-appropriate ways, what had happened to her mother and why. DNA testing confirmed that Ariel Castro was Jocelyn's biological father. This fact created complex emotions and legal questions. Jocelyn was both his daughter and his victim, conceived through rape, imprisoned from birth. The genetic connection to her captor would be something Jocelyn would need to process as she grew older and came to fully understand her origins. Amanda made the decision to shield her daughter from extensive media attention. Unlike the adult survivors who chose to tell their stories publicly to varying degrees, Jocelyn remained largely protected from public scrutiny. Amanda wanted her daughter to have as normal a childhood as possible moving forward, something that had been stolen from her during her first 6 years. Experts who studied Jocelyn's case noted that her age at rescue, 6 years old, meant she retained memories of her captivity. Unlike an infant who might have no conscious recollection, Jocelyn would remember the house, the darkness, the isolation. These memories would need to be addressed through therapy as she matured and developed the cognitive capacity to understand what she had experienced. Yet there was hope. Jocelyn had her mother, who loved her fiercely and had protected her throughout captivity. She had extended family who welcomed her with open arms. She had access to therapeutic interventions and educational opportunities. She had the possibility of a future defined not by the circumstances of her birth, but by her own choices and efforts. Amanda was determined to give her daughter the life that had been stolen from them both. While Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus endured captivity inside Castro's house, their families navigated the nightmare of not knowing. For more than a decade, the families lived in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn because they did not know for certain their loved ones were dead. Unable to celebrate because they did not know where they were or how to bring them home. Lawana Miller, Amanda Berry's mother, became the public face of a mother's refusal to give up hope. She appeared on local news programs regularly, pleading for information about her daughter. She organized community searches. She worked with the FBI and local police, following up on every lead no matter how thin. She kept Amanda's case in the public eye through sheer force of will. The strain took a devastating toll on Lawana's health. The stress of not knowing, the emotional weight of sustained grief without resolution, the frustration of dead ends and false leads all contributed to her physical decline. In March 2006, 3 years after Amanda's disappearance, Lawana Miller died of heart failure at age 43. She died believing she would never see her daughter again, died without knowing Amanda was alive just miles away. The DeJesus family similarly refused to accept that Gina was dead. Felix DeJesus and Nancy Ruiz organized annual vigils on the anniversary of their daughter's disappearance. The events brought the Cleveland Hispanic community together, keeping Gina's name alive in public consciousness. The family maintained a website, distributed flyers, and followed every possible lead. In a cruel twist that would later seem incomprehensible, Ariel Castro attended these vigils. He stood beside the DeJesus family, offered condolences, and participated in the community's collective grief. Castro's daughter Arlene, Gina's best friend, organized remembrances and kept Gina's memory alive among their peer group. Neither Arlene nor any other family member suspected that Castro knew exactly where Gina was because he had imprisoned her himself. Michelle Knight's family faced different challenges. Because Michelle was an adult when she disappeared and was dealing with difficult personal circumstances, including a custody battle, some people assumed she had left voluntarily. This assumption meant her case received less public attention and fewer investigative resources than the cases of the teenage girls. Michelle's family still reported her missing and searched for her, but they did so with less community support and media coverage. The FBI maintained active investigations into all 3 disappearances. Agents followed leads, interviewed potential witnesses, and analyzed patterns. Investigators looked for connections between the cases, noting that Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus had both disappeared from the same general area within a year of each other. This pattern suggested a possible serial abductor, though investigators had no concrete evidence identifying a suspect. Law enforcement faced criticism for the cases going cold. Community members questioned why 3 women could disappear from a relatively small geographic area without investigators identifying the perpetrator. Some critics pointed to socioeconomic and racial factors, noting that cases involving white girls from affluent families often received more resources than cases involving Latina teenagers and working-class adults. The media coverage fluctuated over the years. Initially, Amanda's and Gina's disappearances generated significant local news attention. Anniversary coverage revisited the cases each year, but as time passed without breaks in the investigations, media interest waned. The cases moved from breaking news to cold case status, from frequent coverage to occasional anniversary stories. Despite the fading media attention, the families never stopped searching. They maintained hope against overwhelming odds. Statistics on long-term missing persons cases suggested that the longer someone remained missing, the less likely they were to be found alive. After a decade, most investigators privately believed all 3 women were dead, though they continued working the cases. Community vigils continued throughout the years. Candles were lit, prayers were said, memories were shared. The vigils served multiple purposes, keeping the cases in public awareness, providing communal support for grieving families, and maintaining hope that somehow the missing women would return. The rituals of remembrance helped families cope with the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing. On Seymour Avenue, life continued normally. Children walked to school past Castro's house. Neighbors mowed their lawns. People came and went. The normalcy was haunting in retrospect, the mundane routines of daily life unfolding just feet from where 3 women were imprisoned. The disconnect between the visible life of the street and the hidden horror inside one house illustrated how thoroughly Castro had hidden his crimes. As 2013 arrived, the cases were over a decade old. Michelle Knight had been missing for 11 years, Amanda Berry for nearly 10, Gina DeJesus for 9. The families continued their efforts, but hope dimmed with each passing year. Then, on May 6th, everything changed. The afternoon of May 6th, 2013, began like thousands of afternoons before it on Seymour Avenue. Ariel Castro left his house, departing for reasons that would never be fully explained. Before leaving, he secured most of the house according to his usual careful routine. Doors were locked, windows remained boarded, chains were checked. But on this particular day, Castro made a mistake that would end his decade-long reign of terror. He failed to properly secure one interior door. Amanda Berry, after years of captivity, had developed keen awareness of Castro's patterns and routines. She knew the sounds of his departure. She knew approximately how long he would be gone. She also knew, from previous brutal experiences, that Castro sometimes staged fake opportunities for escape to test his prisoners and punish attempts. The psychological conditioning made escape attempts terrifying propositions even when opportunities. But on this day, Amanda made a decision. She was 27 years old. She had been imprisoned since she was 16, had lost her entire adolescence and early 20s to captivity. She had given birth to and was raising a daughter who had never experienced freedom. If there was even a chance of escape, she had to take it, despite the terror of what Castro might do if it was another test. Amanda approached the interior door and found it unlocked, an unprecedented opportunity. However, the exterior storm door remained secured and bolted. Amanda could see through the screen to the outside world she had been separated from for a decade. She could see neighbors, cars, trees, sunlight. She began screaming for help, pounding on the storm door, her voice raw with desperation and hope. Angel Cordero, a neighbor, heard the screaming and approached the house. He tried to communicate with Amanda through the door, but struggled because he was a Spanish speaker with limited English and Amanda spoke primarily English. The language barrier prevented effective communication at this critical moment. Cordero, unable to help in the way Amanda needed, left to find someone else. Charles Ramsey heard the commotion. He had just arrived home from work with his McDonald's bag, ready for a quiet evening. The desperate screaming pulled him away from his dinner. Ramsey approached Castro's house and saw Amanda's face pressed against the storm door, her hands pounding, her 6-year-old daughter beside her. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. "Help me, I'm stuck in here. I can't get out," Amanda shouted through the door. Ramsey assessed the situation quickly. The storm door was bolted from the inside in ways that could not be easily opened. He suggested they kick out the bottom panel. Together, from opposite sides of the door, they kicked until a hole opened large enough for Amanda to crawl through. Amanda pushed Jocelyn through first, then squeezed through herself. She was free. For the first time in nearly a decade, Amanda Berry stood outside, unrestrained with her daughter. The moment was overwhelming, surreal, terrifying, and hopeful all at once. "I need help. Call the police," Amanda told Ramsey urgently. While Ramsey called 911 from his home, Amanda used a neighbor's phone to make her own call. Her hands likely trembled as she held the phone, as she prepared to identify herself and explain the impossible situation. The 911 call Amanda made became one of the most famous emergency calls in modern criminal history. Her voice on the recording captured the raw emotion of that moment. "Help me, I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped and been missing for 10 years, and I'm here. I'm free now." The dispatcher struggled to process what Amanda was saying. Amanda Berry had been missing for a decade. Most people assumed she was dead. Yet here was someone claiming to be her, claiming to have been kidnapped, claiming to have been held for 10 years. The dispatcher asked Amanda to confirm her name and requested her to stay where she was. Help was coming. Cleveland police officers Michael Tracy, Barbara Johnson, and Anthony Espada received the call and rushed to Seymour Avenue. They arrived within minutes, prepared for they did not know what. When they entered Castro's house, they moved cautiously with weapons drawn, announcing themselves as police, unsure what dangers might await them. As the officers progressed through the upstairs hallway, a bedroom door opened slightly. A thin woman peered out tentatively before entering the hallway. Michelle Knight had heard the commotion, heard police announcing themselves, and realized that rescue had finally come. She leaped into Officer Barbara Johnson's arms, repeating over and over, "You saved me! You saved me!" Then another door opened, and Gina DeJesus emerged. The officers stood in the hallway of Ariel Castro's house with two more women who had been missing for years, women whose cases had gone cold, women most people believed were dead. The scale of what they had stumbled into was becoming clear. This was not a single kidnapping, but multiple kidnappings spanning more than a decade. The officers escorted Michelle and Gina out of the house. All three women, along with Jocelyn, were immediately taken to Metro Health Medical Center for medical evaluation and treatment. The physical and psychological trauma they had endured required immediate professional attention. Amanda and Gina were released from the hospital the next day. Michelle, who had endured particularly severe abuse and forced miscarriages, remained hospitalized until May 10th. News of the rescue spread through Cleveland with astonishing speed. Within hours, Seymour Avenue was crowded with police vehicles, FBI agents, news crews, and community members. The street that had hidden such horror for so long suddenly became the focus of international media attention. Neighbors struggled to process that 3 missing women had been imprisoned just feet away for years. Felix DeJesus and Nancy Ruiz learned their daughter was alive. After 9 years of not knowing, 9 years of vigils and prayers and fatting hope, Gina was coming home. The joy was overwhelming, tempered by the knowledge of what she had endured. Amanda Berry's sister Bate received news that her sister, long presumed dead, was alive. The reunion between Amanda and her family was emotional beyond description. Amanda had missed her mother's death, missed years of her family's lives, but she was alive and would be able to rebuild relationships. Michelle Knight's family also received notification, though her reunion would prove more complicated given the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and the years of estrangement that followed. At approximately 6:30 that evening, Ariel Castro was arrested at a McDonald's restaurant near Seymour Avenue. He appeared calm when officers approached him, showing no signs of panic or distress. He was taken into custody without incident and transported to Cleveland Police Headquarters. The man who had successfully hidden 3 women for over a decade, who had attended vigils for one of his victims, who had lived a double life with stunning effectiveness, had finally been caught. Castro's brothers, Pedro and Ariel Castro, were also initially detained after the rescue as investigators worked to determine whether they had knowledge of or involvement in the kidnappings. Both brothers denied any knowledge of the crimes. Investigators found no evidence connecting them to the kidnappings, and they were released several days later. Ariel Castro alone bore responsibility for the decade of horror. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue became a crime scene. FBI evidence teams spent days processing the property, photographing everything, collecting physical evidence, documenting the chains, locks, and modifications Castro had made to imprison his victims. The investigation would provide the foundation for the criminal charges Castro would face. In the hours and days following the rescue, law enforcement agencies launched an intensive investigation into the full scope of Ariel Castro's crimes. FBI Special Agent Steve Anthony coordinated federal involvement, while Cleveland police detectives handled local aspects of the investigation. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue became the central focus, a crime scene that would reveal the systematic nature of Castro's decade-long imprisonment of 3 women. Evidence technicians photographed every room, every lock, every chain, every modification Castro had made to transform an ordinary house into a prison. The physical evidence was overwhelming and disturbing. Heavy-duty locks had been installed on interior doors, far beyond standard residential hardware. Chains with padlocks were anchored to walls and heavy furniture. Windows were not only covered, but reinforced to prevent breaking or opening. In the basement where the women had initially been held, investigators found evidence of the conditions the women had endured. The space was dark, damp, and claustrophobic. Anchoring points for chains were still visible. The basement documented the early years of captivity before Castro moved the women to upstairs rooms. The second-floor bedrooms revealed the long-term imprisonment arrangements. Each room had been converted into a cell. Doors featured multiple locks operated from the outside. Windows were boarded and reinforced. Investigators found plastic toilets that Castro had provided instead of allowing the women access to a bathroom, creating degrading conditions designed to dehumanize his prisoners. Evidence of Jocelyn's existence in the house included children's items and signs that Amanda had tried to create a space for her daughter within the horrific constraints of their captivity. The contrast between items for a child and the prison-like conditions of the house underscored the profound abnormality of Jocelyn's first 6 years. Investigators collected biological evidence, including DNA samples that would later confirm Ariel Castro was Jocelyn's father. They photographed injuries on the women's bodies. They documented everything meticulously, knowing that this evidence would form the basis of a prosecution that would need to prove not just kidnapping, but years of sustained sexual violence, physical abuse, and psychological torture. Law enforcement interviewed the 3 women extensively, though carefully and with appropriate trauma-informed protocols. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus provided detailed accounts of their abductions, their years in captivity, the abuse they endured, and Castro's methods of maintaining control. These interviews were emotionally grueling, but legally necessary. Michelle described being abducted on August 23, 2002. The years of sexual violence, the forced miscarriages Castro had caused through starvation and beatings. Her testimony about the pregnancies Castro had terminated would become critical to the aggravated murder charges prosecutors would bring. Amanda recounted her abduction on April 21, 2003, her captivity, giving birth to Jocelyn under horrific conditions on Christmas Day 2006, and the years of raising her daughter in imprisonment. Her account documented not only her own abuse, but Castro's crimes against her daughter. Gina, who had been 14 when she was kidnapped on April 2, 2004, described her abduction while walking home from school, her years in captivity, the abuse, and the strategies the women had developed to support each other and maintain hope. Her account revealed the psychological torture of being held by her best friend's father. Investigators examined Castro's background, speaking with former family members, co-workers, and neighbors. A pattern emerged of domestic violence against Grimalda Figueroa, documented in court records from 2005. The domestic violence history established that Castro had a long pattern of violent control over women, predating the kidnappings. Cleveland police also faced difficult questions about missed opportunities to discover the kidnappings earlier. Records showed police had been to Castro's house at least twice during the decade the women were imprisoned there. In 2004, police investigated after Castro left a child alone on his school bus. In 2000, police responded to a call Castro made about a disturbance on the street. In neither case did officers enter the house or detect anything suspicious. Neighbors were interviewed about what they had seen or suspected. Most expressed shock and disbelief that 3 missing women had been imprisoned on their street. Some recalled seeing Castro's windows boarded up but had attributed it to his personal preferences. A few remembered seeing a girl in an upstairs window, likely Jocelyn, but had not thought to report it because they assumed it was a relative visiting. The investigation expanded to Castro's employment history. The Cleveland Metropolitan School District, where Castro had worked as a school bus driver for 22 years until his termination in November 2012, provided employment records. Investigators learned that his firing was related to rule violations, including leaving his bus unattended, though these infractions were unconnected to the kidnappings. The revelation that a school bus driver had been hiding such heinous crimes for years while transporting children shocked the community. As evidence accumulated, prosecutors prepared to bring charges that would reflect the full magnitude of Castro's crimes. The case was not just 3 kidnappings, but thousands of individual criminal acts spanning more than a decade. Each instance of rape, each assault, each day of unlawful imprisonment, each forced miscarriage represented separate offenses. The investigation also examined whether anyone else had knowledge of or involvement in the crimes. Castro's brothers were cleared after investigators found no evidence they knew about the captive women. Castro's children expressed shock and horror at their father's crimes. Investigators concluded that Castro had acted alone, successfully compartmentalizing his criminal behavior from his public life. FBI Special Agent Steve Anthony told reporters that the women were emerging from conditions comparable to a prisoner of war camp. The comparison captured the systematic nature of the abuse and the sustained trauma the women had endured. The investigation documented not just crimes, but human rights violations committed on American soil over more than a decade. On May 9, 2013, 3 days after the rescue, Ariel Castro made his first court appearance. He entered Cleveland Municipal Court wearing an orange jail jumpsuit, his face partially obscured by holding his shirt collar over his nose and mouth. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. The man who had held 3 women captive for over a decade now stood before a judge to answer for his crimes. Judge Lauren Seymour set Castro's bond at $8 million, $2 million for each of the 4 victims: Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Jocelyn Berry. The amount reflected the severity of the charges and the danger Castro posed. The initial charges included 4 counts of kidnapping and 3 counts of rape, though prosecutors made clear these were preliminary and far more charges would follow. Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Timothy McGinty announced that his office would seek aggravated murder charges related to the forced termination of Michelle Knight's pregnancies. Under Ohio law, intentionally causing a miscarriage through violence could constitute aggravated murder, charges that carried the possibility of the death penalty. McGinty stated that Castro would be charged for every act of sexual violence, assault, and other crimes he committed, suggesting the final count could reach into the hundreds or thousands. On June 7, 2013, a grand jury returned an indictment containing 329 counts against Castro. The charges included kidnapping, rape, aggravated murder for the forced miscarriages, felonious assault, and gross sexual imposition. The indictment detailed crimes committed between August 2002 and May 2013, documenting over a decade of sustained criminal conduct. The 2 counts of aggravated murder related to the termination of Michelle Knight's pregnancies were particularly significant because they carried potential death penalty specifications. Prosecutors argued that Castro had intentionally caused miscarriages through starvation and physical violence, actions that met Ohio's legal definition of murder. These charges meant Castro could face capital punishment if convicted. On July 12th, a Cuyahoga County grand jury returned an expanded indictment, bringing the total charges to 977 counts. The massive indictment included 512 counts of kidnapping, 446 of rape, 7 of gross sexual imposition, 6 of felonious assault, 3 of child endangerment, 2 of aggravated murder, and 1 of possession of criminal tools. The charges reflected prosecutors' intention to hold Castro accountable for every single crime he committed over more than a decade. Castro's defense attorneys faced an impossible task. The evidence against their client was overwhelming. 3 living victims could testify. Physical evidence from the house corroborated the women's accounts. Castro's own statements to police provided admissions. There was no viable defense strategy that could result in acquittal. Behind the scenes, plea negotiations began. Prosecutors had to weigh several factors: The strength of their case, the wishes of the victims, the trauma a trial would inflict on the women who would have to testify, and the certainty of outcome. Defense attorneys had to consider that Castro faced the possibility of execution if convicted of the aggravated murder charges at trial. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus each had to decide whether they wanted to testify at trial or whether they would accept a plea agreement that would spare them that ordeal. Testifying would mean confronting Castro in open court, describing in detail the abuse they endured, and subjecting themselves to cross-examination. The prospect was re-traumatizing. On July 26, 2013, less than 3 months after the rescue, Castro accepted a plea agreement. He pleaded guilty to 937 counts, with 40 counts dropped as part of the deal. The charges to which he pleaded guilty included kidnapping, rape, and aggravated murder. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Castro would receive a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 years, ensuring he would never be released. The plea agreement also stipulated that Castro would forfeit his house at 2207 Seymour Avenue. The property would be demolished, ensuring it could never become a macabre tourist attraction or cause continuing trauma to the victims and community. On August 1, 2013, Castro appeared in Cuyahoga County Court for his sentencing hearing. This hearing would give the victims an opportunity to confront their captor and allow Castro to make a statement before receiving his sentence. The courtroom was packed with media, family members, and concerned community members. Michelle Knight chose to deliver a victim impact statement in person, the only one of the 3 women to appear at the hearing. Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus provided statements through representatives, choosing not to face Castro directly. Michelle's decision to confront Castro demonstrated remarkable courage given what she had endured. Michelle's statement was powerful and devastating. She described the torture, the isolation, the forced miscarriages, the daily fear, and the psychological warfare Castro had waged. She told Castro directly about the suffering he had caused. "I cried every night. I was so alone. I worried about what would happen to me and the other girls every day. Days never got shorter. Days turned into nights, nights turned into days, years turned into eternity." She confronted Castro about his hypocrisy, how he attended church every Sunday before coming home to torture the women he held captive. She told him about the friendship between herself and Gina, how they had supported each other through the nightmare. Then she delivered her most memorable lines. "I spent 11 years in hell. Now your hell is just beginning. You will face hell for eternity." Castro was given an opportunity to address the court. His statement was rambling, self-pitying, and demonstrated no genuine remorse or understanding of the magnitude of his crimes. He claimed he was not a monster, but rather someone with an addiction. He blamed pornography for his behavior. He claimed he was driven by sex and characterized himself as sick rather than evil. "I'm not a violent predator. I'm not a monster. I'm a normal person. I'm just sick. I have an addiction just like an alcoholic has an addiction," Castro told the court, words that rang hollow given the decade of torture he had inflicted on 3 women. Forensic psychiatrists who evaluated Castro rejected his characterization of himself as mentally ill. Dr. Gregory Sothoff testified that Castro showed no psychiatric illness whatsoever. Experts identified him not as sick, but as someone likely suffering from antisocial personality disorder with sexual sadism, someone who derived pleasure from inflicting suffering and who chose to commit his crimes with full awareness of their wrongfulness. Judge Michael Russo delivered Castro's sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 1,000 consecutive years. The judge told Castro there was no place in this city, no place in this country, indeed no place in this world for those who enslave others. Castro was immediately transported to the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio, where he would be processed and held in protective custody due to the notorious nature of his case. The sentence ensured he would never again be free. The women he had imprisoned had their freedom. He had lost his forever. 1 month later, prison death. On the evening of September 3, 2013, less than 1 month after his sentencing, Ariel Castro was found hanging in his cell at the Correctional Reception Center in Orient, Ohio. Prison staff discovered him at 9:20 in the evening during a routine check. Castro had hanged himself using a bedsheet. Medical personnel immediately began CPR and transported him to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 10:52 that evening. The Franklin County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy and ruled Castro's death a suicide by hanging. The manner and timing of the death, occurring so soon after sentencing, raised immediate questions about prison protocols and whether Castro should have been under closer observation. Castro had been held in protective custody due to the notorious nature of his case, which meant he was in a single cell rather than general population. Prison policy required guards to check on him every 30 minutes. He was not on official suicide watch, which would have entailed more frequent monitoring and removal of items that could be used for self-harm. Jo Ellen Smith, a spokeswoman for the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, explained that Castro was being checked every half hour, but emphasized he was not deemed a suicide risk requiring special watch protocols. The determination that Castro did not require suicide watch would later be questioned by his defense attorney and others who believed someone facing Castro's sentence should have been monitored more closely. 2 corrections officers, Caleb Ackley and Ryan Murphy, were on duty in Castro's housing unit at the time of his death. Both were placed on paid administrative leave pending investigation into whether proper protocols were followed. The Ohio State Highway Patrol launched an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Castro's suicide. Craig Weintraub, Castro's defense attorney, told media outlets that his client should have been on suicide watch given the magnitude of his sentence and the adjustment to life in prison. Any sort of intake screening for a psychological assessment may have been inadequate, Weintraub said. He called for an investigation to ensure proper safeguards were in place to prevent similar occurrences. Investigators found 2 handwritten notes in Castro's cell after his death. One was entitled, "Love my kids and grandkids." The notes provided some insight into Castro's state of mind, but did not contain detailed explanations for his decision to end his life. Days before his suicide, Castro had expressed doubt about his ability to cope with imprisonment, telling evaluators, "I don't know if I can take this." The investigation into Castro's suicide concluded that he had committed the act alone and that the prison staff had followed existing protocols. However, the case prompted discussions about suicide prevention in prisons and whether high-profile inmates serving extreme sentences should automatically be placed under enhanced monitoring regardless of whether they explicitly expressed suicidal ideation. Public reaction to Castro's death was mixed. Some people, including family members of the victims, expressed that Castro had taken the easy way out, escaping decades of punishment he deserved to endure. Michelle Knight had told Castro at his sentencing that his hell was just beginning, but he had cut that hell short after less than a month. The sentiment that he had avoided justice by dying so quickly was widespread. Others viewed Castro's suicide as a form of justice, arguing that he could no longer consume resources or occupy public attention. Some felt his death provided closure, though victim advocates cautioned that Castro's suicide might complicate the survivors' healing processes by denying them the knowledge that he was experiencing consequences for his crimes. For Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, Castro's death meant different things. They no longer had to live with the knowledge that he was in prison, potentially appealing his case or seeking attention. Yet his suicide also meant he would never face decades of punishment, never fully experience accountability for his crimes. The complex emotions his death triggered would become part of their ongoing recovery process. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue had been demolished in August 2013, shortly before Castro's death. The vacant lot was filled with pink flowers as a temporary memorial until the community could decide on a permanent use for the property. The demolition ensured the house could never become a macabre attraction or continue causing trauma through its mere existence. Castro's death closed a legal chapter, but did not close the chapter for his victims. They continued their healing journeys, their advocacy work, and their efforts to reclaim the lives that had been stolen from them. Castro's suicide was a footnote in their stories, not the ending. The survivors' paths forward. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight faced the monumental task of rebuilding lives that had been interrupted for over a decade. Each woman chose a different path forward, shaped by her individual experiences, personality, and the support systems available to her. Their journeys demonstrated both the resilience of the human spirit and the long-lasting impacts of sustained trauma. Amanda Berry returned to her sister's home in Cleveland after her rescue. She reunited with family members who had never stopped hoping for her return, though she grieved the mother who had died believing she would never see Amanda again. Amanda focused on creating stability and normalcy for Jocelyn, who needed to adjust to a world vastly different from the only one she had known for her first 6 years. Over time, Amanda made the remarkable decision to use her experience to help others. She partnered with Fox 8 News in Cleveland to create a segment called Missing with Amanda Berry. The daily segment profiles missing children and adults, helping to keep cases in public awareness and potentially leading to recoveries. The work allowed Amanda to transform her trauma into purpose, using the platform her story provided to advocate for missing persons. Amanda's decision to work in such a public role required overcoming profound fear of being in the public eye. After years of being hidden and controlled, choosing visibility was an act of courage. She has described the work as meaningful, giving her a sense that something positive could come from the nightmare she endured. Gina DeJesus also chose advocacy work as part of her healing journey. She and her cousin Sylvia Colin founded the Cleveland Family Center for Missing Children and Adults, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families of missing persons. In a powerful symbolic gesture, Gina deliberately opened the center on Seymour Avenue, just down the street from where Castro's house had stood before its demolition. The decision to locate the center on the same street where she had been imprisoned demonstrated Gina's determination not to be defined or limited by her trauma. She transformed the site of horror into a place of hope and help for others. The center provides resources, support, and advocacy for families navigating the nightmare of having a loved one missing. Gina and Amanda co-authored a memoir titled Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland, published in 2015. The book detailed their abductions, their years in captivity, and their paths to recovery. Writing and publishing their story allowed them to control the narrative of their experiences and potentially help others who had survived trauma. Michelle Knight chose a different path. She changed her name to Lily Rose Lee, symbolically shedding the identity associated with her victimization and claiming a new name for the life she was building. Michelle moved away from Cleveland, seeking distance from the place where so much trauma had occurred. Michelle also wrote a memoir, Finding Me, A Decade of Darkness, A Life Reclaimed, published in 2014. The book provided her perspective on the captivity, the abuse, and her journey toward healing. Michelle's account was particularly important because her case had received less attention during her captivity, and her voice helped complete the historical record. In addition to writing, Michelle became an advocate for missing persons and survivors of abuse. She has spoken publicly about her experiences when she chooses to do so, on her own terms. She got married and has worked to build a life defined by her choices rather than by what was done to her. All three women have required extensive therapeutic support to process the trauma they endured. The psychological impacts of sustained captivity, sexual violence, and psychological torture do not resolve quickly or easily. Post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and complex trauma all require ongoing treatment and management. The women have also had to navigate the challenges of adjusting to a world that changed dramatically during their captivity. Technology evolved. Cultural references shifted. Friends and family members aged. Navigating these changes while also processing trauma created compounding challenges. For Amanda, ensuring Jocelyn's healthy development has been a central focus. Jocelyn required therapy to process her early childhood experiences and adjust to normal life. Amanda has worked to provide her daughter with privacy and normalcy, shielding her from media attention while ensuring she has the support she needs. The three women have maintained varying levels of contact with each other. During their captivity, they formed bonds that helped them survive. After rescue, they each needed to pursue their own healing paths, which meant different things for each woman. They have expressed mutual respect and support while acknowledging that their individual journeys required different approaches. By 2023, a decade after their rescue, all three women had been free for as long as they had been captive. This milestone represented a significant marker in their healing journeys. They had reclaimed time equal to what had been stolen from them. Amanda told interviewers, "We're doing great." The simple statement carried profound weight, a declaration that Castro had not succeeded in destroying them. The women's advocacy work has had tangible impacts. Amanda's missing persons segments have helped generate leads in active cases. Gina's center has provided support to families who otherwise might have felt alone in their searches. Michelle's willingness to speak about domestic violence and captivity has helped other survivors feel less isolated. Their stories have also influenced how law enforcement and media approach missing persons cases. The fact that three women were found alive after a decade, when most had assumed them dead, reinforced the importance of never giving up on missing persons cases and maintaining investigation efforts even when cases go cold. Systemic failures and questions. The Cleveland kidnappings raised profound questions about systemic failures that allowed Ariel Castro to imprison three women for over a decade without detection. While Castro bore sole responsibility for his crimes, examining what went wrong in the systems designed to protect citizens and investigate crimes became necessary to prevent similar failures in the future. Law enforcement faced scrutiny for missed opportunities to discover the kidnappings earlier. Records documented that police had been to Castro's house at least twice during the decade the women were imprisoned there. In 2004, police investigated after Castro left a child unattended on his school bus. Officers interviewed Castro, but did not enter his house or detect anything suspicious. The 2004 investigation followed Castro's employment violation, but did not trigger any red flags that might have led to a search of his home. The women were there, chained and hidden, while police stood outside. The proximity of discovery to actual imprisonment remained heartbreakingly close. In 2000, police responded to a call Castro himself made reporting a disturbance on the street outside his house. Again, officers had contact with Castro at his home without detecting the captive women inside. These documented contacts raised questions about what signs officers might have missed or what additional scrutiny Castro's home might have received under different protocols. The missing persons investigations themselves came under examination. Michelle Knight's case received significantly less attention and fewer resources than the cases of Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus. The disparity reflected troubling patterns in how law enforcement and media respond to missing persons cases based on the age, race, socioeconomic status, and circumstances of the missing individual. Studies have documented that cases involving young white females receive disproportionate attention compared to cases involving adults, minorities, or individuals with complex backgrounds. Michelle was an adult dealing with custody issues when she disappeared, factors that led some investigators to theorize she had left voluntarily. This assumption meant her case did not receive the same urgency as the teenage girls' cases. The pattern of differential response to missing persons cases reflects what scholars and advocates have termed missing white woman syndrome, a media and law enforcement tendency to focus more resources and attention on cases involving young, white, middle-class females while giving less attention to cases involving minorities, men, or individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Cleveland kidnappings illustrated this disparity with tragic clarity. Neighbors on Seymour Avenue also faced questions about what they might have seen or suspected. Several neighbors later reported seeing unusual things: windows boarded up, brief glimpses of figures in windows, hearing occasional screams. Yet these observations did not translate into reports to police or suspicions that something criminal was occurring. The reluctance to report suspicions reflected several factors: not wanting to intrude on a neighbor's privacy, assuming explanations for unusual observations that did not involve criminal activity, and the general tendency in urban neighborhoods for people to mind their own business. The cultural norm of respecting privacy worked in Castro's favor, allowing him to maintain his crimes behind a facade of normalcy. The Cleveland kidnappings also revealed gaps in background screening for positions. Continuing the fully corrected script of public trust. Castro worked as a school bus driver for 22 years, transporting children daily while simultaneously holding 3 women captive in his home. The fact that someone could maintain such a profound double life while working in a position requiring public trust raised questions about screening and monitoring procedures. Castro's documented history of domestic violence against Grimalda Figueroa, including a protection order filed in 2005 that detailed years of severe abuse, existed in court records. Yet this history did not prevent him from continuing his employment with the school district for years afterward or trigger any additional scrutiny. While Castro's eventual termination in November 2012 was related to employment violations, the disconnect between documented domestic violence and continued employment in a position involving children highlighted systemic gaps. The broader issue of domestic violence as a predictor of escalating violent behavior became part of the post-kidnapping analysis. Experts noted that Castro's abuse of Figueroa established a pattern of violent control over women that predated the kidnappings by years. The failure to hold Castro accountable for that abuse, to enforce the protection order that Figueroa filed, or to impose meaningful consequences may have contributed to his belief that he could continue escalating his violent behavior without detection. Community members questioned why 3 women could disappear from a relatively small geographic area without investigators identifying a suspect. Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus both disappeared within a year of each other from nearby locations. This pattern should have suggested a local predator with knowledge of the area and access to potential victims. Yet Castro, who lived in the neighborhood and had connections to the victims' families, was never identified as a suspect during the active investigation. The fact that Castro attended vigils for Gina DeJesus while she was imprisoned in his home represented a particularly disturbing failure of detection. His presence at these events, his interactions with the grieving family, his participation in the community's collective trauma all occurred in public view, yet no one suspected him. The psychology of this deception, how Castro maintained his facade while committing such heinous acts, revealed the limitations of human intuition in detecting skilled manipulators. Media coverage patterns also came under scrutiny. The extensive coverage Amanda Berry's and Gina DeJesus's cases received contrasted sharply with the minimal attention Michelle Knight's disappearance garnered. This disparity meant public awareness was lower for Michelle's case, potentially reducing the likelihood that someone might have information or recognize her. The media's role in determining which missing persons cases receive sustained attention has real consequences for investigation outcomes. After the rescue, law enforcement agencies examined their protocols for missing persons investigations and developed recommendations for improvement. These included maintaining active investigation efforts even in cold cases, reconsidering assumptions about voluntary disappearance in adult cases, and ensuring equitable resource allocation across cases regardless of the missing person's demographics or circumstances. The Cleveland kidnappings also influenced national conversations about human trafficking and captivity. While Castro's crimes were not technically human trafficking as legally defined, they highlighted that captivity and enslavement can occur in residential neighborhoods, not just in scenarios involving organized criminal enterprises. The case expanded public understanding of how victims can be hidden in plain sight. Advocates for missing persons used the Cleveland case to argue for legislative changes, including Amber Alert expansions, better coordination between law enforcement agencies, and sustained funding for missing persons investigations. The fact that all 3 women were found alive after years of presumed death provided powerful evidence for never giving up on cases. The systemic failures revealed by the Cleveland kidnappings were not unique to that city or that case. Similar patterns of missed opportunities, differential treatment of missing persons cases, and failure to connect warning signs have been documented in other cases. The Cleveland kidnappings became a catalyst for examining these broader systemic issues and implementing reforms. Ultimately, no system can guarantee the detection of every crime or the prevention of every tragedy. Human beings are complex, skilled manipulators can deceive even trained observers, and privacy protections limit invasive monitoring. Yet the Cleveland kidnappings demonstrated that improvements were possible. Better protocols for responding to domestic violence, more equitable treatment of missing persons cases, enhanced communication between agencies, and cultural shifts encouraging people to report suspicions rather than assuming innocent explanations. The women who survived Castro's captivity should not have had to endure a decade of torture before being rescued. The systemic failures that enabled Castro's crimes represented a collective societal failure. Examining those failures honestly, implementing meaningful reforms, and maintaining vigilance became moral imperatives in the aftermath of the Cleveland kidnappings. 2207 Seymour Avenue stood for 101 days after the rescue before it was demolished. During those 3 months, the white clapboard house transformed from crime scene to symbol of horror to target for demolition. The decision to destroy the structure rather than leave it standing represented a deliberate choice by the community and the legal system about how to memorialize trauma. After FBI evidence teams completed their forensic work, the house stood empty. It had been processed thoroughly, photographed extensively, and stripped of anything that might serve as evidence in Castro's prosecution. What remained was a structure that contained over a decade of suffering within its walls, a building that had functioned as a prison while appearing from the outside as an ordinary home. The community overwhelmingly supported demolition. Neighbors did not want to live next to a constant reminder of the horror that had existed on their street. The families of the survivors wanted the physical structure that had confined their loved ones erased from existence. City officials recognized that leaving the house standing risked it becoming a macabre tourist attraction, drawing morbid curiosity seekers to a residential neighborhood trying to heal. As part of his plea agreement, Ariel Castro forfeited ownership of the property. This legal step cleared the way for the city to take possession and proceed with demolition. The house's destruction became a condition of the plea deal, ensuring Castro could not profit from his crimes through any future sale or transfer of the property. On August 7, 2013, demolition began. Heavy machinery arrived on Seymour Avenue in the early morning. Neighbors gathered to watch, some crying, some embracing, some silent. The act of tearing down the house carried profound symbolic weight, a physical manifestation of destroying the prison that had held 3 women captive. The demolition crew worked methodically, pulling apart the structure piece by piece. The walls that had contained screams no one heard fell. The rooms where women had been chained crumbled. The basement where the initial captivity occurred was exposed and then destroyed. Every board, every nail, every fragment of the house was removed. Michelle Knight released a statement through her attorney as the demolition proceeded. Nobody was supposed to be in that house after we left. The demolition of the house is the demolition of a prison. Those people are finally free. The demolition took several hours. By afternoon, the house was reduced to rubble. The debris was hauled away, leaving an empty lot where the structure had stood. The vacant space represented both absence and possibility, a scar on the neighborhood, but also an opening for something new. Community members placed flowers on the empty lot, creating an impromptu memorial. Yellow ribbons, a symbol that had been used during the years the women were missing, appeared tied to nearby trees and fences. The memorialization reflected the community's need to acknowledge what had happened while also marking its end. discussions began about what should eventually occupy the site. Some community members advocated for a permanent memorial to the survivors, though others worried this would keep the trauma alive indefinitely. Some suggested a park or garden, a place of beauty and life to replace the site of suffering. Others proposed leaving the lot vacant, allowing grass to grow over the footprint of the house. The property remained a vacant lot for years following the demolition. Eventually, it was planted with grass and flowers. The address 2207 ceased to mark a house and instead marked a space of remembrance. Neighbors continued to maintain the lot, keeping it clean and occasionally placing fresh flowers. The demolition of Castro's house paralleled similar decisions in other high-profile criminal cases. The homes of serial killers and mass murderers have often been demolished to prevent them from becoming attractions or shrines. The destruction acknowledges that some spaces become so associated with horror that they cannot be repurposed or reclaimed for ordinary use. For Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight, the demolition represented a tangible severing from their captivity. The physical place where they had suffered no longer existed. They could never be returned to it. The house's destruction was not merely symbolic but psychological, removing from the world the structure that had confined them. The empty lot on Seymour Avenue became part of the broader landscape of the Cleveland kidnappings, a physical reminder that exists not as a building, but as an absence. The space invites reflection on what occurred there, while also demonstrating the community's determination to not allow Castro's crimes to permanently define the neighborhood. Years after the demolition, neighbors passing the lot often pause briefly, remembering. Children who were born after the kidnappings play on the street, unaware of its history. Life continues on Seymour Avenue, not unchanged by what happened at 2207, but not frozen by it either. The demolition enabled this forward movement, this gradual healing. Psychological dimensions of captivity. The decade of captivity Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus endured created profound psychological trauma that extended far beyond the physical abuse they suffered. Understanding the psychological dimensions of prolonged captivity helps illuminate both what the women experienced and the challenges they faced in recovery. Experts in trauma psychology have studied their case as an example of extreme human resilience in the face of sustained psychological warfare. Prolonged captivity creates a unique form of trauma distinct from single-incident traumatic events. Rather than experiencing one horrific event and then beginning recovery, captives experience ongoing trauma with no defined endpoint. The nervous system remains in constant high alert, never able to fully rest or process experiences because new traumatic events keep occurring. This sustained stress causes cumulative psychological and physiological damage. Castro employed multiple psychological control mechanisms beyond physical restraints. Isolation was primary among these. By keeping the women separated from each other much of the time and completely isolated from the outside world, Castro prevented them from forming supportive bonds or maintaining connections that might sustain their sense of identity. Isolation breaks down psychological resilience by removing external validation of reality. Castro also engaged in systematic psychological manipulation designed to destroy the women's sense of self-worth and hope. He repeatedly told them they were worthless, that no one was searching for them, that their families had given up. These messages, delivered consistently over years, became internalized even when the women intellectually knew they might not be true. The gap between knowing something rationally and believing it emotionally created internal psychological conflict. The unpredictability of Castro's behavior functioned as a control mechanism. Some days he might provide adequate food, other days he would starve his prisoners. Some days he would enter their rooms multiple times, other days he would leave them alone for extended periods. This unpredictability prevented the women from establishing any sense of routine or safety. They existed in constant hypervigilance, never knowing what each moment might bring. Castro also staged fake escape opportunities to test his prisoners and punish escape attempts. This psychological torture conditioned the women to fear taking action even when real opportunities arose. The staged tests created what psychologists call learned helplessness, a state where individuals stop attempting to change their circumstances because previous attempts have been punished. The women developed various psychological survival strategies despite the overwhelming circumstances. Dissociation, the psychological process of detaching from present experiences, allowed them to create mental distance from abuse they could not physically escape. Many trauma survivors describe feeling as though they were watching events happen to someone else, or as though they were floating outside their bodies during traumatic experiences. This psychological mechanism protects the core self from being entirely consumed by trauma. The women also maintained hope, however fragile, that they would eventually escape or be rescued. This hope functioned as a lifeline, giving them reason to survive each day. Amanda's determination to survive for her daughter Jocelyn, Michelle's anger at Castro and refusal to let him completely break her spirit, and Gina's memories of her family all provided psychological anchors that kept them connected to life beyond captivity. The bonds the women formed with each other, despite Castro's efforts to keep them isolated, became crucial to survival. When they could communicate, they offered each other emotional support, shared information about Castro's patterns, and validated each other's experiences. These connections reminded them of their humanity and provided relationships Castro could not fully control. The development of Stockholm Syndrome, where captives develop positive feelings toward their captors, has been documented in some captivity cases. However, evidence from the Cleveland kidnappings suggests the women did not develop genuine positive feelings toward Castro. They may have shown compliance to avoid punishment, a survival strategy distinct from actual psychological bonding. Understanding this distinction is important for recognizing that survival-based compliance does not indicate that victims bear responsibility for their abuse. The psychological impact of captivity extended to the women's fundamental sense of time, identity, and agency. Time lost normal meaning when days blurred together without variation or markers. Identity became fragmented when external validation and social roles disappeared. Agency, the sense that one's actions matter and affect outcomes, eroded when every aspect of life was controlled by another person. After rescue, the psychological challenges did not end, but rather shifted form. The women faced the task of processing over a decade of accumulated trauma while simultaneously adjusting to a changed world and rebuilding lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, including intrusive memories, nightmares, hypervigilance, and avoidance of trauma reminders, affected all three women to varying degrees. Complex trauma, the term used to describe the effects of prolonged, repeated traumatic experiences, created additional challenges beyond typical PTSD. Complex trauma affects personality development, emotional regulation, relationship patterns, and fundamental beliefs about self and world. Recovery from complex trauma typically requires long-term, specialized therapeutic intervention. Each woman's psychological recovery path was unique, shaped by individual factors including age at abduction, pre-existing psychological resources, the specific abuse she endured, and the support systems available after rescue. Michelle, who was oldest when abducted and endured the longest captivity and most severe abuse, including forced miscarriages, faced particularly complex recovery challenges. Amanda had to balance her own recovery with ensuring her daughter's healthy development. Gina, who was youngest when abducted, lost her teenage years and early 20s to captivity, developmental periods crucial for identity formation. Psychological experts emphasize that recovery from such extreme trauma is possible, but requires sustained support, specialized treatment, and time. The women's willingness to engage in therapy, their determination to reclaim their lives, and the support of family and community all contributed to their healing journeys. Their stories demonstrate both the profound psychological damage sustained captivity causes and the remarkable human capacity for resilience and recovery. The investigation into Castro's mind. Following Ariel Castro's arrest, forensic psychiatrists and psychologists were tasked with evaluating his mental state, determining his competence to stand trial, and assessing whether psychiatric illness played a role in his crimes. These evaluations, conducted over several months, provided insight into the mind of a man who had successfully maintained a double life for over a decade, appearing normal to the outside world while committing sustained atrocities in his home. Dr. Gregory Sothoff, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Castro extensively, reached a conclusion that contradicted Castro's own characterization of himself at sentencing. Castro had claimed he was sick and suffered from an addiction that drove his behavior. Dr. Sothoff testified unequivocally that Castro had no psychiatric illness whatsoever. This finding meant Castro's crimes could not be attributed to mental illness, delusion, or inability to understand right from wrong. The evaluation determined that Castro was fully competent to stand trial. He understood the charges against him, could assist in his own defense, and possessed the cognitive capacity to participate in legal proceedings. His cognitive functioning was normal. He showed no signs of psychotic disorders, severe depression, or other psychiatric conditions that might impair his ability to understand or participate in his trial. Experts who studied Castro's behavior and statements identified him as likely suffering from a personality disorder rather than a psychiatric illness. Personality disorders involve deeply ingrained patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that differ significantly from cultural norms. Unlike psychiatric illnesses, which are typically understood as diseases affecting brain chemistry or function, personality disorders involve stable characteristics of how a person relates to the world. The specific characteristics Castro exhibited aligned most closely with antisocial personality disorder, with sexual sadism. Antisocial personality disorder involves a pervasive pattern of disregard for the rights of others, lack of empathy, manipulation, and violation of social norms without remorse. Sexual sadism involves deriving sexual pleasure from inflicting psychological or physical suffering on others. The combination created a psychological profile of someone who enjoyed control and suffering. Castro's ability to compartmentalize his life demonstrated sophisticated psychological functioning rather than impairment. He successfully maintained employment, relationships with his children, musical pursuits, and community involvement while simultaneously imprisoning and torturing 3 women. This compartmentalization required complex cognitive and emotional management, suggesting high-functioning capacities rather than illness-induced dysfunction. The evaluations examined Castro's claims about his motivations and mindset. He had told police he was driven by sex and characterized himself as having an addiction similar to alcoholism. Experts rejected this characterization as an attempt to minimize responsibility and generate sympathy. While sexual compulsivity exists, it does not cause people to kidnap and torture others for decades. Castro's crimes involved far more than sexual impulses. They involved systematic planning, sustained effort, and sadistic control. Castro's statements during his sentencing further revealed his psychological state. He claimed he was not a monster, but rather a normal person who was sick. He blamed pornography for his behavior, suggesting external influences rather than personal responsibility. He expressed no genuine remorse for the suffering he caused, instead focusing on self-pity about his imprisonment and attempts to generate sympathy. Forensic experts noted that Castro's statement demonstrated narcissistic features common in individuals with antisocial personality disorder. He viewed himself as the victim, even while sitting in a courtroom facing his actual victims. He minimized the severity of his actions while exaggerating the difficulty of his circumstances. This distorted self-perception reflected profound lack of empathy and inability to perceive situations from others' perspectives. The psychological profile that emerged depicted Castro as a sexual predator who carefully planned and executed his crimes over an extended period. His selection of victims with connections to his family, his modification of his house to function as a prison, his methods of psychological control, and his success in hiding his crimes all demonstrated premeditation and ongoing criminal intent. Experts contrasted Castro's case with captivity cases where mental illness played a more central role. Some kidnappers operate under delusions or psychotic beliefs that, while not excusing their actions, provide some explanatory framework rooted in psychiatric illness. Castro demonstrated no such delusions. He knew exactly what he was doing, understood it was wrong, and chose to do it. The evaluation findings were crucial for the legal process. Because Castro was competent to stand trial and his crimes were not the product of mental illness, he could be held fully criminally responsible. The findings supported the prosecution's approach of charging him with every crime he committed and seeking the most serious penalties available under law. Castro's suicide in prison 1 month after sentencing raised questions about whether the psychiatric evaluation had adequately assessed his suicide risk. The evaluators determined he was not mentally ill and did not require specialized mental health treatment or monitoring. This finding influenced the prison's decision not to place him on suicide watch. Whether a different evaluation outcome might have prevented his suicide remains uncertain. The psychological investigation into Castro's mind ultimately revealed what many found most disturbing. He was not insane, not delusional, not driven by uncontrollable impulses. He was a calculating predator who chose to commit his crimes, who enjoyed the suffering he inflicted, and who felt entitled to treat women as objects for his use. Understanding that such evil can exist in people who appear normal, who function in society, who pass psychiatric evaluations as sane, remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the Cleveland kidnappings. Media coverage and public reaction. The rescue of Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight on May 6, 2013, generated immediate and sustained international media attention. The story contained elements that captured public imagination. 3 women missing for over a decade suddenly found alive, a daughter born in captivity, and a neighbor who appeared normal revealed as a monster. The media coverage shaped public understanding of the case, while also raising ethical questions about survivor privacy and trauma exploitation. Initial news reports focused on the dramatic rescue itself. Charles Ramsey's interviews with local television stations went viral, his authentic reactions and colorful language making him an unlikely celebrity. Ramsey's statement that he knew something was wrong when a little pretty white girl runs into a black man's arms sparked conversations about race, perception, and which missing persons cases receive attention. Television networks provided extensive coverage in the days following the rescue. The story dominated news cycles, displacing other national and international stories. Images of Seymour Avenue, Castro's house, and photos of the women from before their abductions appeared constantly on screens worldwide. The public hunger for information about the case seemed insatiable. As details emerged about the conditions of captivity and the abuse the women endured, media coverage became more graphic. Some outlets provided disturbing details about chains, sexual violence, and forced miscarriages. Victim advocates and ethicists criticized media outlets for sharing unnecessary graphic details that served no public interest while potentially re-traumatizing the survivors and invading their privacy. The women initially released brief statements through representatives expressing gratitude for the rescue and requesting privacy. Amanda Berry released a video thanking supporters and asking for space to heal. These requests for privacy conflicted with intense public curiosity and media demand for interviews, photos, and ongoing updates about the women's recovery. Some media outlets respected the women's privacy requests, providing coverage focused on the investigation and legal proceedings rather than intrusive speculation about the survivors' personal lives. Other outlets pursued more aggressive coverage, attempting to contact family members, publishing unauthorized photos, and speculating about the women's conditions and futures. The publication of the 911 call Amanda made immediately after her escape became particularly controversial. While the call documented a crucial moment in the case, its release also shared Amanda's raw emotional state during one of the most vulnerable moments of her life. The decision to release the recording raised questions about balancing public interest in high-profile cases with survivor privacy rights. Public reaction to the case was overwhelmingly sympathetic toward the survivors and vengeful toward Castro. Social media platforms filled with expressions of support for the women and wishes for severe punishment for Castro. Vigils and prayer services were held in Cleveland and other cities. The community's collective grief over what had happened mixed with joy that the women were alive. The case also sparked broader social conversations. Discussions about how to prevent similar crimes, how to improve missing persons investigations, and how communities can stay vigilant without becoming paranoid gained prominence. The Cleveland kidnappings became a reference point in national debates about human trafficking, captivity, and violence against women. As the legal process unfolded, media attention continued. Castro's court appearances drew packed courtrooms and extensive coverage. His sentencing hearing, particularly Michelle Knight's powerful victim impact statement, received significant attention. News outlets broadcast portions of her statement, bringing the survivors' voices into the coverage in a controlled way they had chosen. Castro's suicide in prison 1 month after sentencing generated another wave of intense coverage. Media outlets debated whether he had escaped justice or received a fitting end. The coverage of his death was extensive, but shorter-lived than the coverage of the rescue, with most outlets moving on to other stories relatively quickly. Over subsequent years, media interest in the case continued through anniversary coverage, publication of survivors' memoirs, and updates about their lives. Amanda Berry and Gina DeJesus participated in controlled media appearances to promote their book and advocacy work, exercising agency over when and how their stories were told. Michelle Knight also participated in select media appearances to promote her book and advocacy work, though she granted fewer interviews and maintained more distance from public attention. Her different approach to media engagement demonstrated that survivors of the same crime can have varying comfort levels with public visibility. Television networks produced documentary programs about the case, some more respectful and educational than others. Lifetime created a television movie about the kidnappings that received mixed reactions. Some viewers appreciated dramatization bringing attention to the case. Others criticized the exploitation of real trauma for entertainment purposes. The ethical tensions in media coverage of the Cleveland kidnappings reflected broader challenges journalism faces when covering traumatic events involving identified victims. Balancing public interest, survivor privacy, educational value, and commercial considerations creates complex ethical terrain with no clear universal answers. The survivors' decisions to write and publish memoirs represented a form of taking control of their narratives. Rather than having their stories told entirely by others, they chose to tell their own stories in their own words. This self-authorship provided agency many trauma survivors find healing, while also satisfying public interest in ethical ways. More than a decade after the rescue, the Cleveland kidnappings continue to resonate in multiple domains: criminal justice, victim advocacy, missing persons investigations, and public consciousness. The case's legacy extends beyond the specific crimes Ariel Castro committed to broader impacts on systems, policies, and cultural understanding of captivity, resilience, and survival. The Cleveland kidnappings fundamentally changed how law enforcement approaches long-term missing persons cases. The fact that 3 women presumed dead were found alive after over a decade provided powerful evidence for maintaining active investigations, even in cold cases. Police departments nationwide reviewed protocols for missing persons cases, with many implementing changes to ensure sustained investigative efforts regardless of how much time has passed. The disparate treatment Michelle Knight's case received compared to Amanda Berry's and Gina DeJesus's cases sparked important conversations about equity in missing persons investigations. Advocates used the Cleveland kidnappings to highlight how missing persons demographics, age, circumstances, and family situations influence the resources and attention their cases receive. This advocacy contributed to efforts to ensure more equitable treatment across all missing persons cases. Amanda Berry's work creating the Missing with Amanda Berry segment for Fox 8 News in Cleveland directly impacts ongoing missing persons cases. The daily segment keeps cases in public awareness and has generated leads that assisted investigations. Amanda's transformation of her trauma into advocacy work that helps others represents a powerful legacy of the Cleveland kidnappings. Similarly, Gina DeJesus's Cleveland Family Center for Missing Children and Adults provides tangible support to families navigating the nightmare of having a loved one missing. The center's location on Seymour Avenue, the same street where Castro's house stood, symbolizes the transformation of a site of horror into a place of hope and help. The center's work directly assists families while keeping the Cleveland kidnappings lessons alive in practical application. The case contributed to public understanding of captivity and human trafficking. While Castro's crimes were not technically human trafficking under legal definitions, they demonstrated that captivity and enslavement can occur in residential neighborhoods, not just in scenarios involving organized criminal enterprises. This broader understanding influenced public awareness campaigns and prevention efforts. The Cleveland kidnappings also influenced discussions about domestic violence as a predictor of escalating violent behavior. Castro's documented abuse of Grimalda Figueroa preceded the kidnappings by years. The failure to hold him accountable for that violence, combined with the later kidnappings, reinforced advocates' arguments that domestic violence must be taken seriously and perpetrators must face consequences to prevent escalation. The demolition of Castro's house set a precedent for how communities handle sites associated with notorious crimes. The decision to destroy the structure rather than allowing it to be repurposed or to become an attraction reflected thoughtful consideration of survivors' needs and community healing. Similar approaches have been taken with other properties associated with horrific crimes. The psychological research into trauma and resilience that emerged from studying the survivors contributed to clinical understanding of complex trauma and recovery. The women's different healing paths illuminated how individual factors shape recovery trajectories and reinforced the importance of survivor-centered approaches that respect individual choices about how to heal. The case influenced cultural productions including books, documentaries, and films that explored the themes of captivity, survival, and resilience. While some of these productions raised ethical concerns about exploiting trauma, others provided educational value and kept important conversations alive in public consciousness. For the survivors themselves, the lasting impact involves ongoing healing journeys, advocacy work, and lives rebuilt after profound trauma. More than a decade after their rescue, Amanda, Gina, and Michelle, now Lily Rose Lee, have each carved paths forward defined by their choices rather than solely by what was done to them. Their resilience in the face of unimaginable horror provides inspiration, while their advocacy work creates tangible positive impacts. The Cleveland kidnappings remain a touchstone in discussions about violence against women, captivity, missing persons, and justice. The case enters public discourse when similar crimes are discovered or when issues related to the case arise in policy debates. The women's names and stories remain known, keeping the lessons of their experiences alive in collective memory. Perhaps most importantly, the Cleveland kidnappings demonstrated that surviving extreme trauma is possible, that healing can occur even after prolonged horror, and that humans possess remarkable capacity for resilience. The survivors did not merely survive. They reclaimed their lives, pursued meaningful work, and refused to be defined only as victims. Their agency in the aftermath of captivity stands as powerful testimony to human strength. The legacy of the Cleveland kidnappings is neither simple nor entirely positive. The case represents a profound failure of systems that should have prevented or detected Castro's crimes earlier. It represents years of suffering that should never have occurred. Yet the case also represents the power of never giving up, the importance of treating all missing persons cases with urgency, and the human capacity to survive and heal from even the most devastating trauma. On May 6, 2013, 3 women walked out of 2207 Seymour Avenue into freedom after more than a decade of captivity. Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus had endured conditions designed to break them completely, yet they emerged with their humanity intact. Their survival was not merely physical but psychological and spiritual, a testament to human resilience in the face of sustained evil. Ariel Castro transformed an ordinary Cleveland house into a prison where he exercised absolute control over 3 human beings. His crimes were not impulsive acts, but systematic torture spanning over a decade. He successfully maintained a double life, appearing normal to the outside world while committing atrocities behind locked doors. His ability to hide such horror in plain sight reveals unsettling truths about how evil can exist alongside apparent normalcy. The case exposed systemic failures. Police visits that did not detect the imprisoned women, missing persons investigations that went cold, domestic violence that went unpunished, and disparate treatment of cases based on victims' demographics. These failures provide lessons for improving systems designed to protect citizens and investigate crimes. Yet the story of the Cleveland kidnappings is ultimately not Castro's story, but rather the story of 3 women who refused to be destroyed. Michelle's courage in confronting Castro at his sentencing, Amanda's transformation of trauma into advocacy work helping other missing persons, and Gina's creation of a center supporting families of the missing all demonstrate that survivors can reclaim their narratives and create meaning from suffering. More than a decade after their rescue, the women continue building lives defined by their choices, their relationships, and their purposes rather than solely by their captivity. They have shown the world that surviving extreme trauma is possible, that healing can occur, and that human beings possess extraordinary capacity for resilience. Their journeys forward honor not only their own strength, but also the memory of all who suffer captivity and violence. The empty lot on Seymour Avenue where Castro's house once stood serves as physical reminder of what occurred there, but it also symbolizes the community's refusal to allow those crimes to permanently define the neighborhood. Grass grows where horror once existed, a simple yet powerful statement that life continues, that healing is possible, and that even the darkest chapters eventually close. The Cleveland kidnappings remind us to never give up on missing persons, to take domestic violence seriously, to question assumptions about who victims are and which cases deserve attention, and to recognize that monsters can wear friendly faces. But most importantly, the story reminds us of the remarkable strength of the human spirit when faced with unimaginable darkness. Amanda Berry, Gina DeJesus, and Michelle Knight did more than survive. They reclaim their lives, they help others, they speak their truths, and they demonstrate daily that captors cannot capture the essence of who we are. Ariel Castro held their bodies for over a decade, but he never held their souls. That is the ultimate testimony to human resilience and the power of hope even in the deepest darkness.